Good morning and hello and welcome to the State of the European Union 2022. What will it mean for Ireland? I'm Emmet Ryan from the Business Post, and it's a pleasure to speak to all of you wherever you're watching, be it in Ireland, Europe, or anywhere around the world. And I'd like to thank the European Parliament Liaison Office in Ireland, the European Commission Representation Office in Ireland, and the European Movement Ireland for organising this wonderful event. Lots of work is taking place behind the scenes that you can't see, but it's ensuring that all of us who you're going to hear from today sound far better than we actually would otherwise. This is very much your event, though, so please get your questions in early and often, and we'll get as many of them as possible done to our panelists today, and we'll make sure we try and get as good a discussion that's led by you, the viewer, the audience, throughout this morning. We're expecting lots of topics to be addressed over the next hour or so, issues such as energy, the cost of living, possible rate increases, and the European care strategy. These are all top of mind right now. Unfortunately, joining me to discuss this, we have a wonderful panel. We have Patricia King, General Secretary of ICTU, Danny McCoy, CEO of IBEC, Adam Lambe of NYCI, Neil McDonnell, CEO of ISME, Dominic MacSorley, CEO of Concern Worldwide, and then we'll get two MEP responses from Francis Fitzgerald, MEP for Dublin from EPP, and Billy Kelleher, MEP for Ireland South from Renew. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Patricia King as our first speaker this morning.
Thank you, Chair. I believe the Commission President should address three challenges next week: stemming the rising cost of living, protecting incomes and jobs from spiralling energy costs, and sharing the burden of climate action fairly. First, the cost of living figures are truly frightening. In July, the EU inflation rate was 9.8%, the highest since EU records began. Energy prices, as we know, are rapidly rising to extraordinary levels. And by contrast, average weekly wages in Ireland rose by just 2.4% in the year to June. 43% of households in Ireland may already be in energy poverty, according to the ESRI, and this figure is growing as we speak. And this means that they spend 10% or more of their disposable income on heat and electricity. And all of this is happening in an Ireland that is now a low-pay, high-cost compared to peer European countries. 1/5 of workers are low-paid, according to the OECD, the highest of the EU 15. The European Commission estimates that Ireland's minimum wage is third lowest of EU countries with statutory minimum wages. There needs to be significant increases in the national minimum wage and in all wages to help address the cost of living crisis. It is, we believe, imperative that the Commission President comes forward with proposals to reduce the cost of living, such as through European-wide regulation of energy costs for those in or at risk of energy poverty for as long as the crisis lasts. Second, spiralling energy costs require European efforts to protect the incomes and jobs of workers. Europe needs to adopt measures similar to the support to mitigate unemployment risks in an emergency, otherwise known as SURE, an instrument adopted when the pandemic hit, which helped fund the temporary wage subsidy and so on in Ireland. Support for firms must be provided on condition that they maintain jobs and engage with workers and the representatives. And as President von der Leyen herself said in her 2019 political guidelines, employers and unions are the people who know their sector and their region best. This leads to the third issue that I want to see addressed. The way this crisis has developed since Russia invaded Ukraine highlights our collective failure to invest in green energy, leaving Europe too dependent on Russian fossil fuels. Europe must accelerate implementation of the European Green Deal. This will require even more ambitious efforts by all countries than is currently being considered. And I have to stress that all of this will only succeed if the burden is shared equally. In short, it requires a strong, just transition legal framework based on social dialogue that promotes the creation of secure jobs and communities and ensures that nobody is left behind. And finally, I want to acknowledge the very valuable work of the Commission in bringing forward the hugely important directive on adequate minimum wage and collective bargaining coverage, which in our view will serve to advance the terms and conditions of workers across the EU, and we look forward to its transposition in Ireland. And I want to acknowledge and thank Francis Fitzgerald, MEP, and our colleague Maria Walsh for their constructive engagement over the last 18 months with us, and also Barry Andrews and other MPs. Our thanks to them. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Patricia, for that those comments. Next, we have Danny McCoy, who is the CEO of IBEC. Danny, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Emmet, and good morning, everybody. Like Patricia, I just want to focus in on a number of items. And clearly in the State of the Union address, it's important to distinguish what, in the current energy crisis and inflation crisis, what the European institutions can do and what they can't do. So clearly monetary policy is determined by the European Central Bank, and it's appropriately contractionary at the moment because we need to get our core inflation down. But that leaves the task of dealing with more volatile inflation from energy and raw materials to be handled more structurally by governments, but also coordinated at the European level. So in that regard, the proposals around decoupling of electricity from natural gas is very appealing and is probably the right thing to do. Price caps, however, have lots of unintended consequences, and particularly for our decarbonisation plans and bringing on more renewables. So in the first instance, clearly an intervention is required there, but we also need to be sensitive that this may give perverse incentives on the security supply. So price caps, I think, should be considered as the last option and see how things develop. In that regard, we should make full use of time-limited EU temporary crisis state aid framework. I think this is particularly important on those energy measures that I've been talking about to ensure that we future-proof the resilience of the European energy supply, given what we've learned in the last number of months about the unreliability of our Russian supplier, but also to enable national measures now to support that decarbonisation, which is required to be done anyhow of our industrial processes, which is a kind of a no-regret strategy in terms of security supply, but also delivering on that decarbonisation. The other feature I'd like to see from the President of the State of the Union address is an opportunity for a new model on agreeing social policy at EU level. If negotiations lead to an agreement, it would be a request from the Commission sent to the Council for direct implementation at an EU directive level without change. I think this is particularly important, and Patricia mentioned that as well, is that negotiating a legally binding agreement on telework and right to disconnect must show the value of social dialogue at the EU level as a way to balance employers' and workers' needs, and it can address social policy going forward. I think this is particularly necessary for the cohesion that Europe has required and has shown during both the COVID, Brexit, and now the Russian energy crisis. Finally, I think the other issues now that some are perennial, the completion of the single market, but particularly highlighting the benefits from a fully implemented digital single market strategy could deliver very significant benefits both to the European Union itself, but particularly to Ireland now that we're a net contributor into the EU, estimated at nearly 180 billion euros per annum in economic gains. Again, that would be very important for the Irish business community. And I suppose the last feature is really that the Conference on the Future of Europe requires that multi-stakeholder social dimension, which I think today is probably an indication of the desire among many facets of our social construct here in Ireland and more broadly in Europe about coming together to deal with crisis, but to do so in a coordinated and also in a consensual way. Thank you.
Thank you, Danny, for your comments as well. And a reminder to all of our audience, please get your questions in early and often throughout the event, and we will try and get to as many of them as possible with all our speakers. We've got a great panel here today, and we'd love to share your thoughts with them and hear what they have to say. Next up, it's my pleasure to introduce Adam Lambe of NYCI.
Thanks very much, Emmet, and good morning, everyone. So as you may know, this year has been quite an important year for young people across Europe, as roughly this time last year, Ursula von der Leyen designated 2022 as the European Year of Youth. So at this year's State of the Union, young people want to see a wrap up of the Year of Youth and see what the legacy of this year will be. During this year, we've also had the Conference on the Future of Europe, and it's brought forward some recommendations, especially by young people. One of those has been taken in stride by the European Union, which is the European Union Charter on Youth for Democracy. And the European Committee of Regions is currently working on that, and it should be finished by the end of the year. But we want more actions from the EU as well. One big call that was highlighted in the Conference on the Future of Europe is a European Youth Test. This would be an impact assessment tool for new policies introduced by the European Commission. And it's similar to youth tests that we see in other European countries, such as Austria, Germany, and France. And it's something that would bring young people back to the forefront of democracy. Young people constitute 25% of the population of the European Union, and they are disproportionately underrepresented in democracy. And we want to see this youth test ignite a change in how young people interact with democracy, both nationally and across Europe. So young people should have a say, and there's another call to action that young people are calling from the European Union, and that's to endorse lowering the voting age to 16 for European elections. So this is something that is decided on a national basis, and there's some countries in the EU that have already implemented this, such as Austria, Malta, Belgium, Scotland as well. So this is something that we'd like to see rolled out much wider across the European Union, especially in Ireland. We can see in Ireland there's already 3 bills in the Oireachtas looking to lower the voting age to 16. So this is something that young people are calling for, and it's something that we'd like to see further action on. And especially an endorsement by Ursula von der Leyen next week. And also, as the previous speakers mentioned, the cost of living crisis is the main issue in the forefront today, not only for everyone working, but especially for young people. And something that disproportionately affects young people is unpaid internships. Unpaid internships are an issue that have been around for a very long time. And today in Europe, young people are disproportionately at risk of poverty. And this situation has only been made worse by the pandemic. And if you're a young person that's not being paid to work, doing an unpaid internship, then there's virtually no way that you can support living independently. Most people who are doing unpaid internships are forced to stay with family and rely on others. And it's not of benefit to young people, to business, or to the economy at all. So we're looking for a ban on unpaid internships that will also address how young people are surviving the cost of living crisis. And as we know, the cost of living crisis has been exacerbated by the energy crisis, by the basically large removal of Russian gas from the European energy grid. So what we're hoping for is a further investment in sustainable energies going forward, not just for this winter, but for every winter to come. We hope that the European Union steers away from the direction of fossil fuels. And over this year, we've seen some hiccups in that, such as the taxonomy bill, which classified gas as a sustainable energy. But we're hoping that going forward with the European Green New Deal, that we see further investment in actual sustainable energies, such as solar, wind energies, that can kind of wean us off Russian gas and gas in general. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Adam. panelists. Very, very fascinating and broad areas of discussion there, which I'm sure we'll be getting to in our Q&A later. Next up, it's my pleasure to introduce Neil McDonnell. He is the CEO of ISME. Neil.
Thank you very much, Emmet and all. I'm delighted to have been asked by the European movement to speak to this event today on behalf of Ireland's SMEs. Energy has been very well ventilated now by Danny and Patricia, and I won't go further than say it must be addressed as an issue this winter, but I will say on it that energy security was identified as a risk in our first national risk assessment in 2014, and we did not act on the risks identified. Aside from the energy cost issue throughout Europe, three themes link Irish SMEs with others in the EU and the problems that arise. These I will just very quickly say is the lack of skilled labour, supply chain issues, and the need for us collectively to do what's necessary rather than popular. So starting with the skilled labour issue, over-education remains a significant issue for us in Ireland. We have an abundance of academic education, but an absence of skills education. Vocational learning in Ireland is undervalued by comparison with that of our European peers. Reducing fertility levels will mean even greater labour shortages in future. We'll continue to pull unskilled labour from poorer countries into Europe, but we need a greater equilibrium between education and the needs of industry here. Lifelong learning is not prioritised in Ireland, certainly, but primary, master's and doctoral degrees are. Micro-credentials have become more important for many, or indeed most employers, than university degrees. The H in working from home does not mean a home in the same country. Even SMEs are now offshoring their back office, sometimes outside the EU. And lastly, on the skills issue, soft skills remain overwhelmingly important. Failures in soft skills remain one of the principal reasons for workplace conflict and underperformance, and the pandemic has worsened this issue. We will always trump me in the workplace. On supply chain, we see a confluence of recent events will conspire to shorten global supply chains. Firstly, the mercantilism of the Trump administration will not be completely overturned, in our view, by the Biden administration, because all trade deals are local. The March 2021 blockage of the Suez Canal by the Ever Given and the pandemic reduction in consumer spending all upended global supply chains. China is persisting with lockdowns in reaction to COVID outbreaks. We will see more strategic onshoring in reaction to COVID, the Ukraine war, and the global chip shortage. States will take a strategic view on manufacture, procurement, and storage of medicines, semiconductors, energy, and foodstuffs. CO2 reduction is going to drive shorter supply chains, with consumers having greater visibility of shipping miles. And these factors are all going to conspire to increase the importance of indigenous business in every country. And lastly, on the theme of what is necessary, it is necessary, unfortunately, for workers to pay for their own pensions and an expanded social wage, but it's popular to ask employers to do so. It's necessary for us to quell inflation, but it has been popular to print money for more than a decade, irrespective of the consequences. It's necessary for us to build affordable homes and have affordable rental accommodation, but it has been popular to allow homeowners and others to object to the construction of new homes and permit the demonisation of landlords. It's necessary for us to provide expanded services to a growing population, but it has been popular to fund this with borrowing paid for by our youth and children. We must stop the transfer of wealth from our children to our generation. It's necessary to build essential infrastructure such as housing, energy generation, power transmission, and water treatment. it is popular to object to their construction locally. And for ourselves, we can't continue to criticise politicians for short-term thinking if we only elect those who engage in populist thinking. They're my thoughts on behalf of the SME lobby, and I'll hand it back to you, Emmet.
Thank you very much, Neil. And I'm sure our two politicians earlier will love the thing of we can't afford to keep blaming politicians. That would be a great line. I'm sure they'll stick up on the wall at some point, even if they will leave out the context of the end of that sentence. And our last speaker before we get to our two MEPs is Dominic MacSorley. He is the CEO of Concern Worldwide. Dominic, please.
Thank you, Emmet. As Ireland's leading humanitarian agency and also a key member of DOCUS, look, I just want to say it's great to be on this panel. It's an honour to engage with everyone today. Ireland's commitments to the SDGs and to reaching the furthest behind, it's really a legacy of working with communities across the globe that has really shaped and continues to shape the European Union. I believe the Irish public want the EU to be global leaders, particularly at this time of turmoil. And I believe we're privileged to have the leadership of our MEPs in the Parliament, champions of equality, climate action, and humanitarian assistance. And I think it's important to note that our own commitment, Ireland's and Concern's, is drawn from our nation's own harrowing experience of conflict, hunger, and colonisation. It's in our DNA, and it is this that drives our focus at European and international levels. And obviously, it's been a core theme of Ireland's tenure on the UN Security Council. But I believe this focus and commitment is ever more needed. We face a global humanitarian crisis where over 100 million people have been forcibly displaced. And this is the highest number since World War II. And now a staggering 225 million people in 63 countries are in urgent need of immediate humanitarian assistance. Famine, something we hoped, in fact, we thought we had consigned to history, is back. And today, across the Horn of Africa, a staggering 22 million people have now been pitched into the highest levels of food insecurity. Kenya, Ethiopia, Somalia, and South Sudan. They have had no rain over the past 2 years. Water points have dried up. 1 in 3 livestock are dead, and many more will die. And this week, our worst fears have been realised. The Somalia Food Security and Nutrition Analysis shows that famine will occur in 2 areas of south-central Somalia sometime between October and December of this year. It's a grim picture of human suffering and of the need for life-saving assistance. So I think we can admit that we're all in an era truly of mega crisis, challenges so immense that they can be almost overwhelming to comprehend. So our response cannot be business as usual, and nor does it need to be. The collaboration and extraordinary action shown during the COVID-19 pandemic, although uneven, resulted in a massive reduction of suffering and saved countless lives. And now the people on the front lines of conflict, climate, and food security crisis also demand this level of response. Just a year ago, President Ursula von der Leyen, in her State of the Union speech, said, "Our union will be stronger if it is more like our next generation, reflective, determined, and caring, grounded in values and bold in action." The promise of big, bold action is needed now for the EU to tackle today's challenges, which they need to do professionally, humanely, and at scale. It needs to be big in terms of resources and bold with political courage. These are urgently needed. I think if we just look at one fact, that the global humanitarian appeal in 2020 for 41 billion is today just 1/3 funded. And so we can see very clearly where the collective international donor community is failing. I think importantly, we need to recognize that the knowledge to end global humanitarian need and hunger and minimize the impact of crisis exists, but the resources are grossly inadequate. We know there is no single solution to today's level record of humanitarian suffering, but there is a choice. There's a choice to respond at scale, with speed, and with a truly ambitious level of commitment. The EU is one of the largest and most influential donors within the European Parliament. We know there's already a massive recognition for the importance of humanitarian aid, but more can and must be done. One, we're at a critical time when the discussions around reopening of the multi-annual financial framework, and at the heart of the discussion from the humanitarian perspective, is whether the MFF could be reopened to allow for a significant increase in the EU's humanitarian budget. It must. But if we wait for the midterm review to be completed, any revision will come too late. So we need more timely assistance to become available today for the millions of people who need it today. Janis Lenarchik, the EU Commission for Crisis Management, who we met with the Irish aid agencies and the MEPs recently, has sought to encourage all EU member states to increase their humanitarian aid budgets. There is an over-reliance on a small number of EU member states to support external humanitarian action, and that must be addressed. So we call on all member states to allocate more funding to address these humanitarian needs. We recognise that the EU response to the Ukraine conflict has actually been very coherent, and maybe more than many observers anticipated. But we must ensure that while that retains, that the necessary focus on Ukraine does not result in a lack of attention being given to other urgent and life-threatening crises. And finally, we must recognise that the extraordinarily long drought in the Horn of Africa today, or the catastrophic floods that have just hit Pakistan, weather events of unprecedented duration, are the new norm, and investment in disaster risk reduction and resilience building solutions is needed. The EU is already a leader on innovative resilience models. One example is the 3-year programme implemented by Concern under the pilot programmatic partnership that targets 760,000 people in the DRC, Ethiopia, Niger, Republic of Sudan, and South Sudan. And as with Irish aid, it's a really great example of a donor providing predictable, flexible funding, even in the most challenging contexts, saving lives and investing in capacity strengthening for future crises. It's working, it needs to be replicated and scaled up. And this, I believe, is what the State of the Union must address. There is no sense in merely reflecting on the scale of humanitarian need in the world. We need bold action to respond with speed and scale. The pandemic response was courageous and ambitious, an example of EU leadership at a global scale. We must do the same now for the millions of people facing starvation and catastrophe. Thank you.
Thank you, Dominic. And it is now my pleasure to hand over to Frances Fitzgerald, MEP for Dublin and for EPP.
Thanks very much, Emmet, and good morning, everyone. And can I say thank you for your comments in relation to the MEP's work here. I'm here in Brussels this morning, and it's been a pleasure to work with all of you during the last 3 years, and I'm sure Billy will echo my comments. Look, I think you've touched on everything really that's important. Can I say to you, I've no crystal ball about exactly what's going to happen in the State of the Union address by Ursula, because I think it's still a very fluid situation, actually. We have the meeting of the energy ministers tomorrow. We're having a lot of discussion, for example, in our own party meetings. We're touching on all of the issues, obviously. I mean, this is a Europe-wide issue, obviously worldwide, but certainly the issues you're speaking about and the Irish response, we have particular characteristics in Ireland, of course, that will shape, our response and particular issues that need to be addressed, particularly the structural and investment and so on that's still needed in housing and other areas. But let me just say to you a quote that was, you may have seen it in the Irish Times this week. Europe will be forged in crisis and will be the sum of the solutions adopted for those crises, from the memoirs of Jean Monnet. And I think it's a very interesting point about how we all respond to crisis and how does Europe respond. And a lot of commentators in Europe would say that Europe is good and has responded well to crisis and indeed has been forged by crisis. I think in many ways, I think we're getting better at responding because the world has always had these crises. Of course, what's different now is the very wide communication, awareness, understanding of the impact on all of us and across the globe, indeed, as Dominic has said. So how do we respond to this crisis? So, let me make a few comments on the different crises. I mean, let's take the cost of living and inflation and let's look at what's happening in some of our member states. I can tell you all of our members from the different member states are hugely concerned about the cost of living, the impact on ordinary households and small business, on large business indeed, and so on. I mean, Poland right now has an inflation rate of 16%. Estonia is 25%. Latvia is 20%. Lithuania 21%, and so on. So, I mean, just to call out those figures, I mean, we know what the average is, around 9, but it doesn't show you what is happening in those countries and the extraordinary worry it is for the national governments, and how much we need an EU response. And I have to say that I would be confident in relation to Ursula and the State of the Union address. Let's look at the examples that we have in relation to COVID and Ukraine. I think the very comprehensive response that we saw and the leadership. And a number of you have mentioned leadership and time for leadership. There's no doubt that leadership, both at European and national level, is critical to this. I do agree with Dominic's word of bold. It does have to be bold. It has to be comprehensive. And it really has to help the member states in all of the areas that you've highlighted. I met the Minister for Justice from Ukraine yesterday. And just to look at the impact of the Ukrainian war, which of course is very central to all of this, and the extraordinary dependence, the lens through which we've now seen the extraordinary dependence on Russian gas has never been clearer, particularly, of course, from Germany. Quite extraordinary when we see it so clearly at this point. But, she was saying yesterday, they're looking for 370 billion to begin the reconstruction of Ukraine. They're looking to get a register of the damage in all its forms that's been done. Just imagine the scale of that. And so far, a bit like humanitarian aid, there's 14.5 billion pledged from private sources and more from public. But still, and the war goes on, and appears to be no sign of any resolution. So the leadership from the EU on that, I think, is incredibly important. Ireland is playing its own role, but the impact is going to continue to be serious, and I think more longer term than anybody anticipated. A bit like inflation. I remember hearing the various leaders from, indeed the IMF, ECB, and I remember them coming in and saying, the inflation will, by the end of the year, we should be getting on top of it. Well, that was a very optimistic view, and it turns out not to be the case. Cost of living and inflation, clearly energy is central to that. And I think that we need a very robust anti-inflationary package coming to us from the EU and national governments. And I think we get that. There's argument in relation to energy, whether you cap the Russian pipelines, but capping at the implementation of that is seen as very difficult. If you put caps on energy generally, is that going to work? It's more complicated in its implementation and its likely impact. There's a lot of work to be done to really look at the impacts of all of those. What is going to work best? What's clear is that we have to do something that will protect the various groups that I have mentioned. And of course, the wholesale electricity market, I think, was designed to keep prices low. It's now achieving the opposite effect as the merit system pegs the price of electricity to that of natural gas. And clearly there's going to be movement on that, I would have thought, to begin with. But we will have to probably do more as well. I think any measures that are announced tomorrow will build upon the Repower EU, the European Commission's plan to make Europe independent from Russian fossil fuels well before 2030, in light of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now, I think, again, it was mentioned, do we need to look at the MMF again? Do we need to look at Repower EU again? Do we need to look at the Green Deal? And perhaps in light of the crisis that's happening, a huge impact on citizens and businesses throughout Europe, do we have to look at some of the funding that's there, accelerate some of it, reorient some of it? I think that's inevitable, actually. And I think there will be motivation to do that in order to respond to the current crisis. I think it'll be essential. I mean, because we have to become independent from Russian oil, coal and gas, and the timeframes around some of the issues in the Green Deal, and this is very contentious. We may need to be saying that we will do more towards the end of the goals that we have, towards the end of the period, rather than right now on some of them, because it could be too demanding. And yet we have to keep to the principles around the Green Deal. I often say that, when I was elected in 2019, it was all about green and digital. And now, of course, we've COVID and Ukraine. And as I say, everyone absolutely aware of that. The other question is, how do you keep the other issues, the focus on all of the other issues, the social issues, the social policy, managing supports for small business, managing workers' rights? How do we keep this going? The focus on youth in this Europe where we have the youth year, and build on engagement for future generations, incredibly important. on equality, my own area, this an area I've focused on a lot. This week we have the care strategy announced, violence against women, absolutely worldwide issue. Losing a city the size of Marseille, Amsterdam, Zagreb, by women being killed every 10 years. I mean, what a statistic. So, you know, the work has to go on in all of these areas as well. But look, I'm really only touching on the range of issues. But to say, I do believe it's about leadership from the EU. I do think we need to re-stimulate the leadership of Europe and be proud of what we've done so far and continue to play that role in the world, whether it's on the humanitarian, the energy, dealing with Ukraine or so on. It is about building up the leadership of Europe at an international level while protecting our citizens and, you know, continuing to base it on the democratic values that are so important and which, by the way, are totally under threat within and outside Europe. Only 17% of people, of the world's population, live in democracies, and they are unfinished in many places and under threat. So that's the broader picture that we see here and which we try to deal with through our work. So thank you very much for putting this great session together and for inviting me to be part of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Frances. And really thank you to all the speakers so far before we get to Billy, who we're going to thank as well, because you've all kept to time, which is remarkable for any webinar anywhere ever, never mind this particular grouping. So Billy, I will now hand over to you. This is Billy Kelleher, who is MEP for Ireland South and Renew.
Thanks, Emmet. And just to say welcome to the rest of the guests. My apologies for having to step out. I suppose, you know, we can talk about Europe in the here and now, and we can talk about it from a historical context, and we can gaze into the future. But there is one thing for certain: over the next number of weeks and months, it will be a critical test of the European Union as an entity and also the member states individually as well, because we are now facing an existential crisis in terms of Europe itself, how it can keep the lights on, how it can ensure that we can support hard-pressed families, small and medium-sized businesses, and broader economies as well. And I certainly believe that, you know, if something isn't done quickly, we will be looking at, you know, very serious amounts of inflation, massive recessions in economies across Europe, potentially across the globe. But from a European perspective, we are on the cusp, and we better have intervention measures that address the very immediate issues. I mean, Europe has dealt with a number of crises very exceptionally well over the last number of years. So we had the financial crisis of 2008. We then worked our way through that. Now, there was an awful lot of pain inflicted on citizens, and we were in Ireland one of those where there was severe impact with a contraction of the economy, huge cuts in public expenditure, but we worked our way through it. We worked our way through it in a partnership with the European Union and the various actors, the ECB and others, but at the same time, we got through it. And then no sooner were we coming out of the financial crisis when there was optimism, hope, the Irish economy was growing, where we then had the COVID pandemic. And of course, we then had to start spending large sums of money again to keep the economy primed, to ensure that people weren't suffering unduly, businesses were furloughed, and we wanted to put in supports. But in the backdrop of all of that was the issue of the quantitative easing, which was very necessary, by the way, over the last number of years. So from 2008 onwards, the Fed, the ECB, and many other central banks across the globe were quantitative easing. And there was being trillions of euros pumped in to the world economies. And of course, at some stage, that was going to leak out in terms of inflation. And that was beginning to happen in advance of the Ukrainian invasion by Russia. There was, you could sense that inflation was beginning to creep into the system. The statistics were verifying that. And we were going to have policy responses based on the assumptions of inflation rising a certain amount. So that was already in the system. But the invasion and now where we are in terms of our dependence on Russian gas, the fact that our markets are completely out of kilter with reality really is a huge challenge. And from my perspective, it shows the strength of Europe, but equally it shows the weakness. For example, I mean, everybody, or a lot of people in the European Parliament, even in the Commission, were advising Germany for years that becoming over-reliant and completely dependent on Russian gas was something that shouldn't be allowed to happen. And I can remember debates at committee level and in the European Parliament around the issue of Nord Stream 2, where there was a lot of people saying that Germany was just simply wrong in going down the road of becoming completely dependent on Russian gas, as a stated policy of all governments in Germany over the last number of years, and the fact they were unwinding their nuclear production plants. Now, I mean, the reason I say that is because an individual member state the size of Germany has a huge impact on decisions and policies of every other member state as well. So we're now in a situation where we have to ensure that the German economy can come through these very difficult times, because if the German economy struggles, the European economy struggles. It's as simple as that. So we have to bring forward measures. And, you know, when you look at inflation of 9% in Germany, I mean, that is unheard of. So you're now seeing interest rate rises. The ECB will probably announce a 75% basis point today. So you now have families and businesses across Europe, but just purely from an Irish context, feeling the immediate pressure of energy price rises, coupled with potentially 400,000 mortgage holders, either on variable or tracker, now seeing a major increase in mortgage. So over the last number of months between the previous interest rate and this one, you know, you could be talking about 1,100 euros extra a year in mortgage repayments for average sized mortgages. So families are under significant pressure. Now, I mean, they're all the problems. And I suppose the next thing people will say is, well, what solutions have we? And again, Europe can only act if member states are brave. And sometimes member states will act completely and utterly in a self-interested way. And if that happens, well, I would be very worried about the capability of Europe to respond in a collective manner and in solidarity with member states and also with citizens in terms of policy. So I personally believe that you know, we have to intervene rapidly in the electricity market. I'm actually here in Prague at a conference, an economic and monetary affairs conference. Most of it is taken up with a prearranged agenda. But being honest, this energy security, energy costs, and interest rates is what everybody's talking about. And the fear that we could, you know, very quickly dip into a major recession, with massive inflation, interest rate rises, a lot of job losses, and governments already under huge pressure in terms of public expenditure over the last number of years because of the financial crisis and the COVID pandemic as well. So if we don't get this right, we could be in for a very difficult challenge. Do we have the capacity? I believe we do. Certainly, member states will have to spend more money in terms of targeted interventions for vulnerable cohorts, you know, for small and medium-sized businesses. There's certainly going to have to be supports for energy companies that can't afford to or can't get options on gas anymore. I mean, we do see energy companies in Germany, in Sweden and elsewhere that now need support from their government to actually go to the market to buy gas because of the fact that they just can't get credit anywhere. So if we have that happening, you know, and energy companies going broke, well, then very quickly we're into another spiral of potential risks to energy supply. And that is something that could happen very quickly in Europe too. So we have to be conscious of all those things. Certainly there'll have to be a cap of some form on electricity that's generated by non-fossil means or low carbon emission means. So for example, renewables, hydro, solar, nuclear, for example, they are making massive profits at the moment. Now, I'm not ideologically opposed to profits, but the issue is they're making massive profits because there's a distortion in a market by policies that were underpinned by the European Union to stimulate investment in renewables. It was never foreseen that gas will be more expensive than renewables and other forms of electricity generation. So we have to rearrange the policy around the benchmarking of gas prices. And that has to be done by next week, in my view. So the energy meeting tomorrow in Brussels, it will be significant. And I think a lot of work will be done between that and next week when Ursula von der Leyen addresses the Parliament. But if something isn't done, you know, the actual structure and the solidarity of Europe could very, very quickly wane. And the reason I say this, and I'll finish then, there is strong support for sanctions against Russia to undermine Putin's ability to wage war in Ukraine. Of course, Europe is a democratic institution in many forms. National governments make up the council, and we are going to have a number of rolling elections in Europe over the next number of months and into next year. And there could be a major change in the dynamic of the council in particular and the political makeup of that council. You could see a lurch to the left in some countries, you could see a lurch to the right in other countries. But that centrist sort of view of being pro-European, we all collectively working together, could be undermined by the results of some member states. So there's an obligation on Europe to show solidarity with Ukraine against the Russian aggression and the invasion, but equally Europe has to show solidarity with its citizens and businesses to stave off potential social unrest. And I don't say that lightly. You saw the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vest in France a couple of years ago, when we were talking about small increases in the price of fuels versus the potential massive increases in energy costs across Europe that would put huge pressure on families, on businesses, wage demands, diminishing living standards, loss of competitiveness. So we got to get this right, and it has to happen within the next number of weeks to ensure that we actually have policies that can change the direction of where we're going in terms of energy costs, energy affordability, and energy supply and security. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Billy. And so now, of course, the floor is here for all of you who've been watching wherever you are around the world. We've got people, of course, on our panel in Dublin, in Brussels, I'm in Milan, and many other places. So get your questions in. We have our first one, which I'll get to in a second. And of course, make sure you get those cues in, but also tell us what areas you want our panelists discussing as well. So our first question is a very, very long question from Ronan Jingles from Cork City Council. So I am going to summarize it as best I can. And it is essentially imperative that Europe turns its various crises into viable opportunities by means of systemic approaches that would involve like addressing how climate action, energy self-sufficiency, the cost of energy, and of course like the cost of living and the job situation by creating new jobs through the green economic transition. Essentially, they're all connected. There needs to be a cohesive strategy built around sort of those, so that we don't look at them as one single crisis at a time, but rather a collection of crises which, from what I'm guessing what Ronan's trying to say here, we need to be able to address in one sort of holistic manner. I suppose I'll go to you, Danny, on that first. Would that be sort of the IBEC perspective, that it is sort of, it's not one crisis at a time, it needs to be looked at in a collective manner?
Yeah, thanks, Emmet. That's kind of what I was referring to at the start in terms of coordination between the various policy arms. So again, just to reiterate, we've lived over a really absurd is actually probably the best way to describe it, decade of nearly zero and sometimes negative interest rates. And we almost acknowledge that actually was perverse. And so the central banks moving interest rates now upwards, it may seem like the wrong timing for the pressures we're under, is actually a good thing. So if at the end of this, pricing and the signaling from pricing will be a lot better, so that's some optimism in terms of coordination. However, in the short term, that puts an onus that we use the fiscal and incomes policy. That's quite crucial as well, going back to that social dimension. So there's a lot of coordination here required. But as some of the speakers have said, just this time last year, we were all talking about the climate emergency. And so structurally, there's kind of a no regret strategy here in dealing with the security supply and the geopolitical issues and actually decarbonizing. And the fact that the price signals are now going to be becoming better as a result of appropriate interest rates. This is actually a period of opportunity as much as it is a stress factor. And I'd also say, even though we're caught in the midst of this is not the same as COVID. COVID was much more existential. This is actually a correction of an economic cycle on the core inflation. What's happening on the exaggeration of the natural gas issue is a decision we've made correctly as a society not to buy natural gas from a particular source. That, in some sense in history, that aspect of it, that is all that it is. Huge consequences, but it's not existential. It is actually a decision that we've made that probably should have been made back in 2014 when Russia went into the Crimea. But we're getting there now. So I don't see this period as particularly structurally different economically. It may have geopolitical issues that are fundamentally different, but this is actually easier than the COVID challenge we faced 2 years ago, and collectively we did really well on that one. I'm confident we'll do well on this one too.
Patricia, I'd like to go to you for a response there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm inclined not to be so analytical as to how we are where we are. I'm more inclined to look at the consequences of where we are. And undoubtedly, the origin of the energy, what could look like a catastrophe for a lot of people that we're facing now, originates from the war and so on. But the reality is that a huge number in Ireland, a huge tranche of the population will be faced with bills that they can't afford, serious decisions they have to make in relation to how they heat their homes, how they keep themselves warm, how they generally use their energy. And on top of that, alongside of that, is an inflationary cycle, the likes of which we haven't seen for decades, which means that the value of their wage is much less. And I gave you in my contribution the difference between the increase in wages versus the inflation levels. Now, when the population of a country are faced with that, then those who are elected to and appointed to ministerial positions and so on to manage those affairs have to make policy decisions that are commensurate with the problems that face people. Some of those are taking temporary measures, and some of those are taking more long-term measures. But it is not going to be tenable at all for huge tranches of the population to face those issues and financial problems and so pressures without having commensurate workable solutions for them. Now, there are plenty of pieces of analysis that will be done and can be done by people much more erudite than myself who will analyze that to death. I am more for advocating that we have a well worked out plan. We did that in COVID. To be fair, the employers and trade unions worked really well together with the government to ensure that that was delivered in a very targeted, workable way. I think we can do that again. I understand we come with different solutions, price caps, tariffs, whatever it is. But ultimately, whatever the solution is, whatever it happens in Europe on Friday, whatever happens at cabinet meetings from now on out in our own country, we'll all have to come up with a solution so that people will not face the horrendous prospect that between now and next January, they will have bills they cannot possibly cope with, and so on. So I think the indications actually, and Danny and I attended a top-level meeting of the Labour Economic Forum yesterday. I think the indications are that the government understand and realise the size of the problem that is ahead. And I think that they are seriously looking at measures that need to happen. And we shared with them our views as to what those measures should be. But generally speaking, we have to pick the time, and it's the time for action. I agree with Billy Kelleher, is we need to do it at a time that addresses the problem, not when people have suffered hugely and then we're going in reverse. We have to do it now, and we're in that space now. And the European piece on Friday will be very important, as I said, and the government decisions from now on out will be very important.
Francis, go on there.
Could I just say, I just want to agree with Patricia that the action has to be, commensurate with the challenges. And I personally think that is understood both by the Irish government and at EU level. And I do think the kind of macro policy setting that we've done at a European level will definitely be able to play to that quick response. The Green Deal, the Repower EU, the multi-financial framework, Next Generation EU, that's all about setting out how we deal even before Ukraine, of course, with these big challenges we're facing in the world. And I do think it's a question of, within each of those, as I've already said, how do you accelerate to protect the individuals and businesses and so on? And of course, Danny is right. We were asleep at the wheel when it came to Crimea. Really, we should have been faster in terms of the moves by Russia in both Crimea and Georgia, and see what was happening. It's utterly extraordinary, the level of dependency, and that's why the crisis of moving away is just so enormous. But I think this kind of agreement and the guidance from the Commission about the short-term behavioural changes that are needed, that we hear the Irish government talking about, we need the communication campaigns, and the fiscal measures to really support people, whether it's VAT and supporting, all of the things we've talked about already, like efficient heating systems and, helping people to, conserve as much as possible. It's a huge task, but I mean, it is an enormous task. But we have the model in COVID, I think, of whether it's the social partners working together with government or the EU taking those actions for action right across Europe, not just member states. But Billy is right as well. It's going to take member states seeing the big picture.
And thank you very much for those comments, Francis. Adam, I want to come to you sort of on this broad approach, because obviously, like, getting back to the core question, which was about this need, I suppose, for a collective look at the various crises, because you, as I suppose our youngest person on the panel, with no disrespect to the other panelists, of course, you're sort of in a unique position in that you're seeing how it's affecting your generation. So when you look at sort of the housing crisis, the energy crisis, the cost of living crisis, but also the environmental challenges as well, would you see it as sort of one collective sort of challenge, really, rather than seeing them as individual?
It's definitely the best way to look at it is this interdisciplinary challenge that has affected our generation, I think, disproportionately. With the housing crisis over the past couple of years, the cost of living crisis coming up now. I mean, from our perspective as a younger generation, those going into college now, in the coming weeks and months, having to find, first of all, housing, and then having to be able to support themselves through college, while these extraordinary bills are coming to their dorm rooms, basically, for the next couple of months, is going to be extremely tough on those just starting out in college, those trying to put themselves through college as well. So there's that issue there, that it is disproportionately affecting my generation. And we do, as young people, see that it is this interdisciplinary challenge that is affecting not only housing, cost of living, but is also affecting the climate crisis as well. Like we say now that, we understand the extraordinary reliance on Russian gas, but it's not true. We've seen the reliance on Russian gas years ago. Like, even myself as a younger person remember the controversy and debates over Nord Stream 2 when we were building that pipeline for Russian gas. That was already, we'd already addressed the climate crisis at that point, and then we're constructing new gas pipelines. We've seen similar things happen this year with the taxonomy bill and classifying gas as a sustainable energy, when in fact common sense shows you that fossil fuels are finite, and reinvesting in gas, reinvesting in fossil fuels will not help us for a sustainable future. It will not prevent this from happening again. In fact, it will just exacerbate this in the future when there's similar conflicts, especially in countries with that are gas producers and fossil fuel producers. So we need to see that change of focus, that investment into renewable energies, like we've seen with the Green New Deal. We need to focus on that for a sustainable future for my generation, so that we don't face this again like we're facing now. We don't want to face this again in our 30s when we're looking to build houses, if we even can afford to build houses and have a mortgage in the future. But we do see that it's interdisciplinary, definitely.
Well, I'm 41 and houses and mortgages scare the heck out of me. But Neil, I want to go to you, because what I've been listening from Adam was saying there, and also some of the stuff Billy was saying that as well earlier, it's we moved on with the small companies. It went from it was like about green digital to now what we're seeing with the new challenges, obviously around rates and stuff. Is that making it particularly hard on the small business side, that what the challenge is, so to speak, du jour, is changing with a bit more rapidly than you'd like?
It absolutely is, Emmet, and I would say I would characterise the problems that SMEs have as not at all dissimilar to those from a spending perspective as the consumer. But having said that, what I would like people to take out of this, I would hate to think that all our effort and our political will and effort and horsepower we are going to apply to this problem is going to be on the current side rather than the capital side. I referred to the first national risk assessment Ireland did back in 2014, and when you read it, it's actually really interesting to read when we're having a different crisis 8 years later. Its focus is all about avoiding the next banking crisis, not surprisingly. And you can see that actually they succeeded in doing that, but in doing that, they actually killed the problem. So we've only 2.2 banks left in Ireland now. All the pressure you see to manage this issue now, and I absolutely understand where Patricia is coming from on behalf of our members. Our members are exactly the same now. They want a current expenditure problem to deal with this problem right now. Whereas what we're saying is, irrespective of what we think we'd like politicians to do, in reality, what we need them to do is to take a 10 and a 15 and a 20-year perspective. So while there's going to be huge demands on the Irish and other European exchequers to deal with the right now issue of unaffordable fuel, if you go back to 2014, they spotted this fuel security issue and we didn't spend capital on it. We just didn't do anything about it. And 2 years later, the next NRA was 2016. We analysed our housing problem. We did nothing about it. I can object to a housing development in Kenmare now if I want to tomorrow. I can trot off down to the High Court. And we just have not aligned our systems to deal with this. So from a climate perspective, we have a Green Party in government. I am not going to politicise this issue now, but in tackling our climate change issue, we should have been investing in tidal, green hydrogen and nuclear. We're not even allowed by law to develop nuclear energy. We have done nothing about green hydrogen and tidal. So we need our political class to take a 10 or 15 or 20-year perspective and to spend 80% of their time dealing with that and 20% of their time dealing with what we know is a right now issue. And if I could try and get this point home to Adam more than anyone else, Adam, in very short trousers, if that was a thing 10 years ago, went into the Great Recession owing between 8,000 and 10,000 euro in government debt, came out of that crisis owing 43,000 in government debt. Went into the pandemic 2 years ago.
Those are incredible trousers when you think about it. You go on.
Owing 43,000 euros ahead 2 years ago at the start of the pandemic, and now owes 48 to 50,000 in government debt. That's the point I'm making about our youth. Our youth. Our generation is spending their money. We have to stop, and we need a capital expenditure solution to this, not just throwing money at the current side.
And I think before I go to Dominic, who I actually will go to next, I just want to thank Billy Kelleher for his time. He unfortunately had to go to the airport, but his contribution is most welcomed, and thanks to Billy for his part. Dominic, I suppose the sort of the long-term approach that Neil is talking there, I suppose that's one of the areas you're always very focused on, because the issues you mentioned in the global south there earlier with the famines that are basically around the corner that we know are going to happen, even though they haven't happened yet. Like when we can forecast to this degree, and obviously we understand that sort of, issues like this in the global south affect life up here as much as anything else. Surely that sort of, that sort of macro approach is necessary in order to address the challenges you brought up.
Absolutely. I mean, I think with Ebola, with the refugee migration crisis, now with COVID and with the floods, I mean, we are now in clearly an interconnected world. And I think within that, the public actually understands that what happens over there is actually everybody's responsibility. I think there's a couple of things I just wanted to pick up on. I think a key word is collaboration. We've got to recognize that Ireland is in a unique position where we can have direct access to the MEPs, to France's, right up into the Security Council, Geraldine Byrne-Nason. right? That connectedness that we have. Recently, Jeremy Bernison calling to say, what is happening with the sanctions in North Korea? I'm going into committee. Can you give me this? This is something we have to remember. Not every nation brings that. That connectedness and that relevance is critically important. And the collaboration at a political level also on the ground. We're part of an Alliance 2015, it's called. This is 8 European-based international organizations that have been working together for 20 years. And we have a scale collectively around 95 countries and a collective budget of 1.5 billion. But importantly, this is bringing much greater efficiencies to the NGO sector. Greater voice, but greater efficiencies. And efficiencies is critically going forward, right? We're working in collaboration with them in Ukraine and many other countries. I just think the last 2 points I wanted to make, Emmet, was the pressure now with FCDO now really reneging disastrously on a lot of its overseas aid commitments in the last number of years is going to have to be borne by the EU if we're going to tackle these things. USAID has come in under Samantha Power. We're writing very large checks for this, but they are calling for others. I just want one more point. It's great that Adam is there. We've got to remember that the next generation is the one that's going to be bearing the brunt. And we have to really focus on, Irish Aid has been very generous in ensuring that active citizenship and that whole movement in Ireland stays reinforced. I think Francis's comment about, or Patricia's comment, it was one comment about we should not presume that the Irish commitment to international overseas aid will remain. We've got to work hard at managing that. One thing that we're working on very closely, and we have a session with the Irish Mission in October, is a campaign called Nothing Kills Like Hunger, where we are bringing young people behind a campaign to end conflict-driven hunger. And we have had the voices and consultations from the Democratic Republic of Congo, from Haiti, young people saying, this is what I'm sacrificing. I don't have a job, I don't have this, and this is what needs to change. So I think we can mobilize public opinion and drive that younger generation. We've seen it in climate, because we have to have an optimistic approach to these crises, because the solutions are there. They simply need to be resourced.
Thanks, Dominic. I want to go to Adam in 1 second, but before I do that, just a reminder to everybody, get your questions in, because we are very low on time now. So if you want to get a question answered, now is the time to ask. Adam, before I go back to France, I want to ask you a question about the youth test side of things. You mentioned that earlier in your stuff, and I feel for a lot of people tuning in today, that's something they're unfamiliar with. So just explain to them, I suppose. There's an analogy I like to use, which I think a few of, sort of given generation that parents and people on this panel would appreciate. My dad's 88. So explain to him what the youth test is.
Yeah, well, first I might elaborate on the context that this came up in as well. Francis also mentioned that along with the cost of living crisis and these crises that we're facing, we're also facing a democratic crisis. Democracy is under threat across the world and also in Europe as well. And a recent report by the UN Envoy on Youth, the UN report shows that 76% of those under 30 years old think that politicians don't listen to young people. 8 out of 10 people think that the current political systems need drastic reforms to be fit for the future. And 69% of people think that more opportunities for young people to have a say in policy development would make political systems better. So 50% of the world's population is under 30 years old. So that's quite a large statistic. 25% in Europe, but across the world, it's 50% of young people. 50% of people are under 30. But in contrast to that, only 2.6% of the world's parliamentarians are under 30. So you see there just how much young people aren't engaged in the democratic system, in policies that are affecting them in their future. And this report by the UN also was looking at the idea of lowering the voting age and other ways of engaging people in democracy. And this UN report showed that across all age ranges, 8 out of 10 people think that the voting age should be 18 or lower. So that's a few statistics that kind of give you the context to why the democratic backsliding is happening in Europe, across the world, how civic space is shrinking, especially for young people, youth organizations. and how youth work especially is going unrecognized as well in enabling young people to engage in democracy. So the youth test is something that we actually proposed in Ireland a couple of years ago, but unfortunately not to a very good reception, but also has been proposed now with the Conference of the Future of Europe. One of the key recommendations from the Conference of the Future of Europe this year was to implement a European-wide youth test. So it's the youth test. The idea of it is it's an impact assessment tool for new policies in Europe. So it looks at meaningful engagement of young people in the development of policy, the impact assessment of how these policies will impact young people, how it will impact minorities, and help to reduce inequality gaps, and also looks at mitigation measures for policies that might disproportionately affect young people in a bad way. So it looks at the mitigation measures as well. So this is something that the European Youth Forum and a lot of youth organizations across Europe are advocating for, is this European-wide youth test on policies. And hopefully we can see that in Ireland as well. We've seen Austria, Germany, and France, a couple of other regions as well across Europe. But we'd hope to see that in Ireland policy as well, is the youth check.
Fantastic. And Francis, please, if you could give a response.
Yeah, well, I think it's very interesting listening to what Adam has to say, and it reminds me of many years ago when I began speaking about equality proofing, gender proofing. We eventually got it so that every memo going to cabinet was gender proofed. Now you've got to work very hard on the implementation of that, but it seems to me perfectly reasonable that you would arrive at a point where you youth proof as well. And actually, let me say to you, across Europe, we better start age proofing, because we have this enormous crisis coming up in Europe in relation to care, where we have thousands of older people who will be in need of care of various sorts, and we do not have the people to do the caring. And we're not treating those who do it very well either. So, I think you have to be very sensitive to the life cycle in policy. And I think sometimes there's been just an assumption of, every policy affects everybody the same way. Traditionally, that's, you have your policy, that's it. But actually, what we're seeing is you need to have a far more sensitive tool. So, I'm not surprised to hear Adam calling for that. But let me just add in a few optimistic points that I see myself as an MEP when I go around to schools. When you see the interest of young people in climate change, going for their green flags, when you see them involved in the Blue Star programs and the EU ambassador programs, and we've hundreds of young people here this week engaging them. Now, I accept that you have a bigger job to do in society as a whole, and it may be sort of selected, maybe privileged groups. But I think that is the kind of reach out that we need, because we need all the energy and vitality of our young people, indeed of everyone, if we were to survive the kind of crisis we've been talking about here.
Thanks, Francis. I'm just going to get quick closing remarks. Just one line, please, folks. We are a bit short of time from each of our speakers. So I'll go to Patricia first. Anything you'd like to say to President von der Leyen ahead of the address? You're on mute, Patricia.
I think, Chair, I covered it in the document. 3 pieces: help resolve and stem the energy crisis so that people do not end up in the wrong place on this. The cost of living crisis, likewise, let's have a plan that attempts to deal with some of the ferocious outcomes that certain groupings in our society face on that. And finally, climate change and our reaction to it is non-negotiable. Climate change is happening, and we have to take all the measures to deal with it in the timelines that are set out. And while it's very challenging in the current circumstances we find ourselves in, it should not in any way divert anybody from meeting the ambitions we have set for ourselves. And Europe, I think, should be in their Climate 55 policies and so on, committed to doing that and not be diverted by virtue of current circumstances. Thanks.
Thank you. And Danny.
Thank you, Emmet. Really just to say, look, these moments are of grave crisis are moments of opportunity. There's plenty of no regret strategies here. They're perfectly aligned. And also just in an 8 billion world, even with China supporting Russia, it comes to less than 2 billion. The other 6 billion are by far more dominant. Russia will fail. and we should work on that basis that timing is only the issue. We shouldn't lose our values. We shouldn't lose our structure. We have to react now, but we will prevail on this. It is an absolute certainty, given the scale of what's against Russia, that they will. It's only a question of time.
And Adam, please.
Yeah, it's hard to sum up everything that was spoke about today, but I definitely think that we have to look at this current crises in the larger scheme of things, that everything is an interconnected issue, and that we need to keep our values of sustainability, green development, and young people at the core of this. We need to address the democratic backsliding, and through youth initiatives, such as the Youth Test and the EU Charter for Youth and Democracy. We need to look at how this crisis is disproportionately affecting young people, the cost of living crisis, those in university, those in training and education, and especially those in unpaid internships who can't afford to even live by themselves at that moment.
Thank you, Adam. And Dominic, please.
I think really just to recognise the power of collaboration at the EU level, particularly in relation to overcoming COVID and Ukraine, apply that now today to urgent a humanitarian crisis that is on our doorstep, but also to invest at the political level in addressing the long-term consequences, which is within the reach. The knowledge, the science is there.
And thank you, Dominic. And Neil, please.
Thanks, Emmet. I would say for President von der Leyen, it's certainly a tough gig at the moment, and even with the number of external threats on all sides of the EU, there are still significant national divergences of priority within the EU. So it's extremely difficult tying those threads together. From the worm's eye view that we have as SMEs, we would just say, please don't try and impose unity on the union through ever greater regulation. There is a Small Business Act for Europe, so keep it light, keep it collegiate, and we will be stronger together.
And finally, Frances.
Thank you. Well, I would just say we do need Europe-wide action, undoubtedly, despite those varying national, issues and positions. But that I would be confident that the crisis will be used and will be responded to well by Europe, given what we've seen in relation to COVID and Ukraine. I think a lot of potential there to deal effectively with these enormous challenges, but it'll have to be, reviewed constantly and monitored. And there'll have to be, the point they make about crisis, use a good crisis, there'll have to be flexibility as well, and a willingness to take ongoing action too. I think the big picture will be set by Ursula next week, and we're all, looking forward to seeing that. But even already looking at Strasbourg next week, when I look at the agenda we have next week, it's forest strategy, for example. It just shows the wide range of what we have to do, protecting our forests, such a huge issue as well. The energy directives are being discussed there next week, fisheries and so on. But I would be confident, and the coordination is critical.
Thank you. And I'd like to thank all our speakers, Patricia, Danny, Adam, Dominic, Neil, Frances, and of course, Billy, who had to leave earlier, unfortunately. Thanks to all of you for tuning in. But on behalf of all our speakers and all of you, trust me, I'm going to thank Kieran Murray and Elizabeth Moody, without whom, believe me, this would not have gone ahead at all and would not have been as fun and coherent in any way at all. I've been Emmet Ryan, and until next time, have a good day.
Best of luck. Bye now.
And I think we're clear.